Welcome back, Netrunner fans, to part 2 of my martial law review. In this section, we're going to be looking at all the Corp cards in the pack. First up is a new piece of ice for HB. This is Fairchild. It's a 9 to res, 5 influence, 8 strength code gate Bioroid AP, and it's unique. It has 4 subroutines. The first 2 are end the run unless the runner pays 4. The third is end the run unless the runner trashes one of his or her installed cards. And the last subroutine is end the run unless the runner suffers 1 brain damage. Holy cow, this thing is huge. We've seen a lot of Fairchilds recently, and they've all been pretty good. First of all, what's going on with this thing? You can't click through it, right? This is the second Bioroid we've ever seen like that. The other one, of course, is Wotan, the Lord of the Ice. This card shows that we've made a lot of progress in ice design, and I think that's just generally been a theme of this last cycle. At the high end of ice design, we've been seeing a gradual power creep, and I think that's pretty reasonable given that most of the really expensive high-end ice that we had early in Netrunner, like Wotan, were largely too bad to see any play. One of the things I've always found frustrating about Wotan is, like with Fairchild, they don't necessarily need a breaker to get through it. They can just suffer a bunch of bad effects and get through all the subs. This one is much more punishing, though, at a lower cost, because it's going to make them lose all those credits. And they're almost certainly going to need credits later on in the run to deal with your ice. So I think that is a pretty distinct advantage. This is situated much better in front of other pieces of ice if they're not going to try to break it. And the same thing goes with maybe like Ash or something like that. It's going to be much harder for them to plow through this and still preserve their credit bank. This Fairchild does have a pretty distinct disadvantage versus Fairchild 3, which is that if they bump into this on a face check, it's not going to really do anything. It'll just end the run, whereas Fairchild 3 does at least punish them with those subs. Now, I don't think that's really that big of a deal. You're not usually trying to punish face checking with a 9 cost piece of ice, so this is probably going to fill the role of 1 or 2 of in your deck as one of the highest end, most taxing, biggest, strongest pieces of ice in your deck. Next up is another card for HB. This is an operation called Friends in High Places. It's 2 to play, it's 1 influence, it's terminal, which means after you resolve this operation, end your action phase. Install up to 2 cards from archives, paying their install costs. This card is so obviously and universally good, I'm not sure what I can really say about it. This just is going to be good in basically any deck that can play it. Assuming you have cards that are going to die and you want to reinstall, which I think is basically every deck, this is going to be something you want to consider. And at 1 influence, it's super easy to include. The biggest use that I'm seeing for this is going to be for mass asset decks. A lot of times with those asset decks, your stuff's getting trashed. The runner is trying to keep you from getting a sort of critical mass of these assets rezzed. This is going to be a way for you to get them back. In like controlling the message or maybe Gagarin, you're just going to have all these assets that you're going to want to keep installing. Things like the political assets like Cincy's Actor Guild or Commercial Bankers Group. Boulders are going to be insane to be able to get back after the runner goes and trashes them. It's also a hugely good economic trade there. If the runner has to spend a bunch of clicks and credits trashing your junk, and then you just play this one thing to get 2 of them back, that's going to be a huge credit swing and a huge advantage for you. I'd also point out that within HB, clone suffrage movement has a pretty ridiculous interaction with this. You're going to be able to get back your political asset with this card, and then hopefully later on you'll return Friends in High Places back to your hand. That'll let you do more of that. That seems pretty good. I think it's fair to say that the Museum of History nerf did not get rid of the mass asset style. Rather, it just kind of shifted around the decks and the way we built them. I think this card is certainly going to bring back that style into the forefront if it wasn't already there. IG and Gagarin are certainly going to become a lot more popular with this thing, because this card is just a huge enabler for any deck that has tons of assets. And I don't think that its use is limited to that. In a standard ETF Glacier deck, you're probably going to want to play one or two of this. It's going to get back your Dead Ice, your Caprice they trashed out of R&D. They deal with your Ash and you just get it back. This card is absolutely bonkers. Next up is another card for HB. This is a new region upgrade called Manta Grid. It's 1 to res, 5 to trash, it's 2 influence, it's unique. If the runner has fewer than 6 credits, or no unspent clicks, when a successful run on this server ends, you have 1 additional click to spend on your next turn, and it's limit 1 region per server as they all are. This, to me, seems like a region that you're actually going to want to put on a central server, which is pretty uncommon in Netrunner. You're going to want this on a server where they're actually going to make a successful run and not just run into ice that ends the run or just run the server one time in the whole game. Just having this on a server that's probably going to get run several times could potentially net you a couple of clicks. But it seems like it's going to be pretty hard to rely on this to be able to fast score your 3-for-2s, right? Like, it's pretty easy for the runner to play around this. And unless you get them on that one first turn where you res it, it's going to be, I think the timing of it is going to be kind of clumsy. You're going to have the 3-for-2 ready to go when that run occurs. I think this is definitely something where I need to play with it a little bit before I know whether or not it's going to be good enough. But I do see this as being maybe an interesting way to defend a less defended central server. Next up, we have a new piece of ice for Jinteki. This is Mind Game. It's 0 to res, 3 influence. It's a 4 strength Code Gate Psi Deflector. It has 1 subroutine. Play the Psi game. If you win, choose another server. The runner is now running on that server instead of passing Mind Game. For the remainder of the runner must add 1 installed card to the bottom of his or her stack as an additional cost to jack out. If you'd ever wondered what a deflector piece of ice like Cell Portal or Bullfrog looked like that wasn't terrible, this is it. This has got to be the best piece of deflector and Psi ice ever printed, and this I think is definitely going to see play in a pretty wide range of decks. First of all, this is a 0 to res 4 strength Code Gate that basically ends the run. You have to win a Psi game for it to work, but it's going to end the run on the successful Psi game. That's pretty strong. And it's actually better than just ending the run, because if you throw them into something nasty that they can't break or don't necessarily want to pursue, like you throw them on archives or a server they don't care about, they're going to have to do this jack out thing of adding a 1 installed card to the bottom of their stack. This avoids the 2 big pitfalls that we've seen with other deflector ice. In the case of Cell Portal, it's just entirely too expensive and narrow use. And in the case of Bullfrog, the fact that Bullfrog moves around really undermines its effectiveness because you don't necessarily want it to end up on some useless server. This Mind Game instead just throws them into the useless server and stays remaining defending on the server that you actually care about. I would be remiss to not mention Nisei Division as something that could use this. I've been talking about how Nisei Division has been creeping into playability as we've seen better and better Psi tools, ways to improve Psi games, also better Psi game ice and just recurring effects of Psi games. Here's another in that line. This is a really strong piece of Psi ice, probably the strongest one ever printed. And if Nisei Division was ever going to come out and see play, now might be the time for it. Next up is a new upgrade region for Jinteki. This is Nihongai Grid. It's 1 to res, it's 5 to trash, it's 2 influence, it's unique. If the runner has fewer than 6 credits or fewer than 2 cards in his or her grip when there is a successful run on this server, you may look at the top 5 cards of R&D and swap one of those cards with a card in HQ, and it's limit 1 region per server as they all are. This is pretty similar in some ways to the Manta Grid we looked at just a bit ago. It's going to have this effect that again is probably going to be best on a central server. Now this one I think the condition is a little bit harder to meet with the fewer than 2 cards, especially in decks that have nasty stuff. You're probably not going to see a lot of runs out of the runner with fewer than 2 cards in their grip. I really like the swapping cards effect within Jinteki because it lets you get snares and other nasty things like that out of your hand and back into your deck so that the runner can run into them there. And if you're not using this card to put nasty stuff back into your deck, I don't think it's really worth trying to do this cumbersome thing just to have a fairly marginal deck manipulation effect. So I anticipate this being best in decks that actually have nasty surprises like Snare or Shock or something like that. Next up is a new piece of ice for NBN. This is IP Block. It's 2 to res, 1 influence. It's a 4 strength barrier tracer. When the runner encounters IP Block, give him or her 1 tag if there is an installed AI. Then it has 2 subroutines. The first one is Trace 3. If successful, give the runner 1 tag. And the second sub is End the run if the runner is tagged. This is kind of a more NBN-ified version of Wraparound, and I expect this to see play right out of the pack in basically all of the NBN decks that are really popular. The big thing is a lot of decks are playing AI. So you're running into Faust pretty often, Eater, Opman. There's quite a bit of AI floating around. And this is going to be a way to not only punish those with that win encounter effect, but it also does something outside of that context. One big difference between this and Wraparound is Wraparound just gets utterly crushed by any barrier breaker. Whereas this, it's going to do something reasonable even after they have a barrier breaker. They're going to have to deal with that trace, whether they just beat it with credits or they break it. And a 4 strength barrier with 2 subs is pretty strong if you can leverage both of the subs. Another thing that Wraparound was always soft to is David. If you just have exclusively AIs and you need to break a Wraparound, you can always pull out a David. This is not going to be weak to that. I expect this to see play right out of the pack. It's going to be really strong in existing NBN archetypes, and with Data Ward and Resistor and now this, NBN's got a lot stronger choices and barriers. Next up, we have another piece of ice for NBN. This is Thoth. It's a 7 to res, 3 influence, 6 strength Century Tracer. It's unique. When the runner encounters Thoth, give him or her 1 tag. It has 2 subroutines. Trace 4. If successful, do 1 net damage for each tag the runner has. Then it has Trace 4. If successful, the runner loses 1 credit for each tag he or she has. Here's a Big Daddy Century for NBN. This seems pretty powerful. If you're playing the mass tag style, this gets very, very dangerous after you've hit them with hard-hitting news or mid-season, or even if you just have several tagging ice in a row. That 1 net damage per tag is really brutal, and the 1 credit is pretty relevant as well. The biggest downsides I'm seeing with this are just that it's competing with lots of other good ice in NBN. If you want centuries that are tag-oriented, Data Raven is pretty much the gold standard of that, and there's already several other decent centuries that tag them. And if you just want some really huge, high-end, keep them out of your server, like if you're doing a Glacier-style NBN, you'd much rather just use Toll Booth. That's pretty much the best when it comes to huge, high-end, stop-them ice, and I don't necessarily think this will replace that. This reminds me of Information Overload in a few ways. This is clearly a much better version of that kind of ice, because if they already are mass tagged, this will at least have the virtue of potentially flatlining them. It's really a decent piece of ice. Again, we're seeing the inflation of the power level of some of the highest end ice, but I think it's also checked by the fact that in this faction you already have Tollbooth, and there's a lot of other big ice it's competing with. Next up, we have a new asset for Wayland. This is Anson Rose. He's 1 to res, 4 to trash, he's 1 influence. He's unique, and he's an executive. When your turn begins, place 1 advancement token on Anson Rose. Whenever you res a piece of ice, you may move any number of advancement tokens from Anson Rose to that ice. Now I know what you're thinking, not another advanceable ice card. Well, this guy at least has the decency to be useful with a card like Trick of Light. You could potentially use this to fast score agendas, which has been decent in the past, especially out of Titan. And at 1 to res, 4 to trash, this guy's going to stick around long enough that you can probably get a couple of counters on him. Another card that might be useful with this within Wayland is Back Channels. This guy's just going to charge himself up, and if you let him sit there for a long time, you could potentially use back channels to make a lot of money. Now, it's obvious that this guy is supposed to be used with the advanceable ice, and he's not going to be any good with the Constellation set, since those, by the time you res them, you're not going to have any use for the ability anymore. So it's mainly going to be things that get buffed if they have counters. Now, there's plenty of those, and those have generally been too weak to see much play, but if you're not actually spending clicks and credits to advance those ice, maybe they look a little bit more reasonable. And the card that we're about to look at is a card that interacts with this really well, so let's just move on to this next piece of ice. That piece of ice is for Wayland. It's called Mausolus. It's 4 to res, 3 influence. It's a 5 strength code gate AP. It can be advanced. If it has 3 or more advancement tokens on it, do the parenthetical text instead, otherwise do not resolve it. It has 3 subroutines. The first is the Corp gains a credit or the Corp gains 3 credits. The second sub is do 1 net damage or do 3 net damage. And the third sub is give the runner 1 tag or give the runner a tag and end the run. This is pretty clearly the best piece of advanceable ice we've seen. And the biggest reason for that is that it does relevant stuff outside of being advanced. It's going to be a 3 sub, 5 strength code gate for 4 to res, and all of the subs do something kind of relevant. On top of that, once you've advanced this 3 times, this becomes a very, very cost-effective monster. It's going to have end the run, it's going to do a bunch of damage, and it's going to get you credits. That's going to be something they're going to have to break, and at 5 strength code gate, 3 subs, that's pretty taxing. This is absolutely good enough if you're not doing anything with advanceable ice, and I could see you in a deck that isn't advancing ice, still just choosing to advance this, kind of like we used to do with Shadow or Ice Wall. Just if we didn't have anything else to do, we might advance our ice and make it harder for the runner to deal with it. Now, the guy we just looked at, Anson Rose, certainly looks a lot more reasonable with a card like this. And if we see more advanceable ice that are on this level, I could see Anson Rose being a pretty serious economic tool in those decks. Next up, we have another piece of Wayland ice. This is Sapper. It's 3 to res, it's 2 influence, it's 2 to trash, and it's a 2 strength Century Destroyer. If Sapper is accessed from R&D, the runner must reveal it. When the runner accesses Sapper, he or she encounters it. Ignore this ability if the runner accesses Sapper from archives. It has 1 sub, trash 1 program. This is pretty comparable in a lot of ways to Chrysalis, but I think Chrysalis is pretty clearly superior, and let me explain why. The biggest thing about this is it's going to be a cheap Sentry with a relevant sub, and once they get a breaker, they're just going to run over this thing. But on top of that, it's going to be this liability out of R&D. They're going to be able to trash it, or maybe out of HQ if they access this and trash it. And the biggest difference between this and Chrysalis is almost always going to do harmful damage to the runner, whereas early in the game, before the rig is set up, trashing a program might not actually hurt the runner that much. So in an early game situation where they're just running your empty, your unprotected server, they might access this thing, have to trash their non-existent programs and then just pay 2 to trash this. And on top of that, if you're a smart runner, you know that the scariest things that can happen to your programs usually occur on sentries. So if you're worried about something like this, you're going to get your sentry breaker, and that's probably going to mean you're running over this thing for virtually no credits. There aren't a ton of icebreakers that this compares favorably versus like Cobra. Unless they have a Mongoose, you're probably going to rather have Cobra than this. So you're really relying on its out of R&D surprise factor as being a big part of the card. I could see that being decent if you're already playing a deck that has lots of nasty stuff in R&D, and this is just a way to pad that out, maybe like an Argus style. But overall, I'm just not super impressed with this. I think that it's going to pretty often hit them at times where it doesn't do anything, and in the situations where it could do something, it's probably just going to cost them 1 or 2 credits to avoid the negative effect. Next up, we have a neutral 4 for 2 called Show of Force. It's no influence, it's a security subtype. When you score Show of Force, do 2 meat damage. This is definitely a logical 4 for 2. I think this has some really good potential in a handful of decks. The biggest use that I'm thinking of this is PE. With PE, when you score this, it's going to actually do 3 damage, which is pretty critical. This is a great Mushin Notion outlet. On top of that, this also works really well with a card that I've been increasingly interested in PE, which is 24/7 News Cycle. 24/7's already really solid with Philotic Entanglement. That's a pretty excellent way to finish off your opponent. But this is going to be yet another decent target for 24/7 if they stole your Philotic or you just haven't got your Philotic yet. I could also see this being reasonably good in Argus or maybe a different type of Wayland Flatline deck. Just having another source of meat damage is pretty good. And this is definitely on the right power level for 4 for 2s. I've talked about a lot of times that 4 for 2s are just not that great. And this one, I think, is really starting to push more in the direction that we should see with 4 for 2s. I definitely think this is going to see some fringe play in flatline-oriented decks. The last card in the pack is a neutral current called Enforced Curfew. It's 0 to play, it's 0 influence. It's a current, which means this card is not trashed until another current is played or an agenda is stolen by the runner. The runner's maximum hand size is reduced by 1. Here's another neutral current for no influence for the Corp side of the game. We just saw one of those in the form of Scarcity of Resources a couple of packs ago. That one is pretty obviously better in a more wide range variety of decks. Pretty much every runner deck plays resources, so that's going to be good. This is much more specialized. You're probably going to want to play this in a deck that is doing flatline, but it's really going to shine, I think, the most in the Cybernetics Division decks. I've talked about before how those have a sort of alternative flatline that we haven't really seen, which is reducing the runner's maximum hand size to a negative number. This, with the Cybernetics ID, that's going to bring their hand size down to 3. That means that you have to do way fewer brain damage, and just in general, it's going to make it easier to hit them with those last couple of reduced hand size to finish them off. I really like the idea of introducing more currents that are easy to play in any deck, but this one with a really narrow use, it's probably only going to see play in a very small range of decks, and even then, it's got to be better than the in-faction alternatives, so I don't really think this is going to see a ton of play. That's going to do it for my martial law review. Like I've said many times this cycle, the power level of the cards in this pack is definitely higher than we've seen in a lot of previous cycles. There's way more playables in this pack than are kind of the norm for Netrunner, and I think the biggest trend is that these big, high-end ice are getting better and better with each new release. We've been seeing a real escalation of the power level of high-end ice, I think that's fairly warranted, given that there's been a lot of really expensive big ice that haven't seen a ton of play in the history of the game. Thanks for watching this video. If you liked it, be sure to subscribe and give me a thumbs up. And let me know in the comment section below what you agree or disagree with me about. I'll see you soon for some more Netrunner stuff.